Welcome, everyone. Today, we have the pleasure to be joined by a visionary in the world of space technology, Delian Asparouhov, the co founder of Varda Space. Delian and his team at Varda are working on something truly groundbreaking. They're bringing manufacturing to orbit. Varda offers a path to transform the pharmaceutical industry, potentially leading to reductions in healthcare costs and better patient outcomes. This year, they successfully re entered their W1 capsule and published on the discovery of a third form of HIV drug, ritonavir. They also recently secured a $48 million contract from the US Air Force to test military payloads at hypersonic speed. Delian, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. It's fun to see the community that you've built up on sort of Twitter, and congrats on the phenomenal PA performance over the past sort of year. I think most hedge funds would be jealous to have your returns.
Awesome, man. Thank you very much, and thanks for taking the time today to try to demystify a bit what you guys are doing at Varda. So, if you agree, let's dive right in.
Go for it. Yep.
All right, so you guys are tackling one of the most ambitious challenge in space application. Can you explain what space-based manufacturing is and why it's such a big deal?
Yeah, the idea that microgravity would have sort of value or benefit to a set of manufactured materials is not one that is sort of unique to sort of Varda. There's actually some pretty old papers even from the mid '50s, before humanity had really gotten into orbit, consistently theorizing about the sort of potential benefit of microgravity, and then a variety of obviously experiments starting sort of in the sort of '70s, even the current exiting or sort of lame duck administrator of NASA, Bill Nelson. Former Senator Bill Nelson actually has a photo of him on a sort of space shuttle mission in 1978 doing a protein crystallization experiment. And so, I can't claim that, sort of the idea that microgravity has impact on, sort of various, highly sensitive materials is one that, sort of Varda, invented or anything. The, sort of fundamental, sort of premise of, sort of why there is, sort of benefit comes down to the fact that, gravity is one of the four, sort of fundamental forces of physics. And down here on Earth, we all operate under exactly, sort of one gravity level, which is 1G, and that happens to be based off of the mass of the Earth. You can increase, the perceived gravity levels down here on Earth. So if you spin things up in a sort of centrifuge, whether sort of tabletop size or a room size, you can basically create simulated larger or higher gravity levels through the centrifugal force. But down here on Earth, there is no way to decrease gravity. There's no way to actually get below 1G. You can do temporary things. If you take a sort of 747 plane and have it fly in a parabola, you can get about sort of 30 seconds of sort of microgravity, which is sort of typically not really enough for any sort of significant industrial process. You can also get what I call sort of macroscopic sort of microgravity. So people will sometimes talk about these techniques like acoustic levitation, where you use basically ultrasound speakers to levitate a droplet in the middle of a container. While that does provide some of the sort of benefits that microgravity does, where you don't have that sort of droplet that you're trying to maybe have a reaction happen be touched by any container, and sometimes the sort of droplet to container interface can impact the reaction, and so going to microgravity to remove that droplet container interaction could be a potential sort of benefit. If you look within the droplet, it's still experiencing sort of gravity, even though it's being sort of floated in the middle of the air. So if you were to sort of zoom in and be some of the molecules inside of the droplet, they have no clue that they're being levitated by acoustics. If you were to, let's say, heat the droplet, you'd still have sort of convective sort of currents that are entirely caused by gravity. So point being, there's no way to get microgravity down here on Earth. The only way to do that is to go to space, and it's not to say that you're actually experiencing no gravity. What's actually happening is you're just orbiting around the Earth, such that the centrifugal force perfectly cancels out with the gravitational force on an atom by atom basis. Okay, so that at least explains sort of what gravity is and sort of why we're going to space for microgravity. So I still haven't answered the question of how does microgravity sort of impact sort of certain sort of products, and why is there an improvement when you're up there? It all comes down to the fact that gravity is the primary driver of the largest modes of transport in chemical sort of reactions. that are, above a certain size. So if you go down to like the nanometer scale, at that point, the dominant, sort of function for what determines how things move is what's known as Brownian motion. So that basically is just a random, effectively jiggling of atoms. So when you think about, sort of molecular bonds, if you think about the bond between, hydrogen, oxygen, and H2O, that is, sort of primarily, sort of driven by, both the strong and weak nuclear force as, sort of the primary forces, and then in terms of motion is driven by Brownian motion. But as you start to get up into the sort of hundreds, sort of molecules and, sort of larger length scales, as you start to get into, sort of chemical, sort of reactions, the primary, sort of dominant, what's known as the mode of transport, or the reason that things are basically, sort of moving around, become gravity related sort of transport. And so one macroscopic analogy to, sort of give an example is if you think about a simple chemical system like a candle, where, so you light a candle with a wick at the top of it. On Earth, you obviously, sort of know that you get this, sort of candle flame shape that is a teardrop, and if you put your hand above it, you feel that hot air rising. Fundamentally, the reason that you have both that, sort of teardrop shape and the hot air rising is because of gravity. Basically, that thermal combustion reaction of the candle is creating hot air. That hot air is lighter than the air around it, and in a gravitational field, if you're a liquid or a gas, the lighter, sort of portion of liquid or gas rises to the top of the container, the heavier filters down to the bottom. And so that teardrop shape is actually being caused by that hot air moving upwards. If you had a, sort of imaging camera that allowed you to actually see how the gas is moving throughout the room, we'd actually see is that candle is creating a convective current where you have that hot air moving upwards. It then cools down, comes down from underneath, and then actually moves back up into the candle once it's sufficiently cooled down. If you take that same basic chemical reaction, you do it, in a microgravity environment in low Earth orbit, you still have that same thermal combustion reaction, which, sort of creates that hot air. But in a microgravity environment, there is no up, there is no down, and so that hot air, rather than basically, sort of moving upwards, instead steadily diffuses throughout the entire, sort of room. And so what ends up happening is it actually forms a candle flame shape that is instead a perfect sphere. And so that analogy of the macroscopic candle is effectively what happens at the microscopic, sort of scale. So, if you think back to your high school chemistry class, if you're trying to get to two large sets of, sort of molecules to interact with one another, typically what you're doing is you're, introducing some, sort of thermal energy. You're trying to cross some activation, sort of barrier or activation energy barrier in order to get it into the, sort of final state. When you do that down here on Earth, if one of those molecules is heavier versus lighter than the other, you constantly have that basically, sort of convection, sort of movement, especially as you introduce the thermal energy in that. And so you basically have just like a lot of entropy and a lot of, sort of chaos in the system. And if you were instead to take that, sort of same reaction and do it in microgravity, you can much more, sort of precisely basically, have those molecules interface in the way that you want without that, sort of entropy, that gravity related, sort of transport hitting that. And so that's the, sort of fundamental physics. So what have been the applications? People have basically shown everything from fiber optics, where you can purposely prevent basically what are known as nucleation or crystallization points, which basically introduce opaqueness into the fiber optic. And so what you can have is a much more clear fiber optic where you could communicate for extended lengths. People have shown this in semiconductor, sort of wafers, where you can those same, sort of nucleation points that cause opaqueness in fiber optics also cause defects in wafers, and so you can actually just anneal the wafer and remove those defects in microgravity. And the one that Varda is particularly, sort of focused on around, sort of life sciences. There have been a multitude of proof points, but by far, sort of the most interesting proof point to discuss is that in Q1 2019, Merck basically published this paper showing their blockbuster cancer drug, this drug called Keytruda. It's a monoclonal antibody, which in 2023 did about $25 billion in revenue, and financial analysts estimate that it represents about 125 billion of Merck's 300 billion in market cap. They're basically able to show that, again, due to that, sort of lack of entropy, they were able to much more tightly control the basically size of the crystals that were formed of this cancer drug in a way that would enable them to, rather than having the, sort of current drug delivered via a 4 to 6 hour intravenous drip, which both requires a nurse to administer it, a nurse to monitor it, and obviously requires a patient to significantly disrupt their, sort of day or weekend by coming to a clinic for an extended period of time. Instead, create a form of the drug that would instead enable a high concentration subcutaneous, basically injection. So this means you can give somebody a syringe that they pick up at a pharmacy and can take in the comfort and safety of their own home. And despite the fact that this would have been a massive outcome for sort of patients, significantly improving the experience of taking this type of drug, and for Merck would have been a massive commercial outcome. There hasn't really sort of been any type of commercialization of this, partially because there hasn't really been a sort of partner or a platform that has sort of enabled the commercialization. At the end of the day, the International Space Station and more broadly human-rated space stations are not a place that are sort of economically sort of viable for this type of activity. Most of this type of drug production on Earth is entirely automated. So why in God's name would you want to involve sort of humans in an environment that's incredibly austere and expensive to have humans around? And so the sort of thesis behind Varda was take the fact that sort of cost to orbit has dropped immensely and offer a low cost, high cadence platform to commercialize this type of work that instead looks like a sort of Starlink sized satellite, rather than a sort of human rated sort of space station to do this type of work. And so yeah, super excited that we did our initial demonstration sort of mission, and sort of despite the deep state's best efforts at blocking us from our success, we were able to successfully land February 21st earlier this year. And then we're looking forward to ideally launching and landing 4 times next year, and continuing to both serve our pharmaceutical sort of partners and development pipeline there, as well as you alluded to the fact that we have this $48 million Air Force contract there. They're using us for sort of different use case where it's actually less our microgravity sort of drug reactor capabilities. It's more for the fact that we have to bring those drugs back down because clinical trials happen down here on Earth. They don't happen up in space. And those reentry pods that we built in house to bring those drugs back down also transit through a highly relevant hypersonic regime that is relevant to our Air Force, Navy, as well as NASA customers for testing out basically hypersonic reentry technologies, everything from materials to navigation sensors to detection sensors. And so we act as a sort of, you can think of it as like a sort of hypersonic sort of wind tunnel, given that you can't really recreate this type of environment down on the ground. Anyways, that was maybe a bit longer than you expected for your first answer, but hopefully give an overview of both sort of why microgravity is relevant, the fundamental physics behind it, and then what we're doing for the Air Force.
No, I mean, that was an amazing explanation. To be honest, I've never gotten such a detailed yet simple understanding of the advantage of microgravity. So really appreciate it. And I think I understood like at least 80% of it. So I'm very happy with that. And thanks again. So what kind of time frame are you looking at when you're launching these things before any type of commercialization or drug enhancement? Like what's the timeline looks like from you guys when you take a compound, start working on it, launch it, reentry, and then up to commercialization?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of sort of pre-work that happens ahead of time. There's sort of a sort of pipeline that sort of our drugs sort of that we work on sort of go through, and they come through sort of multiple partners. Some are academic, some are mid-stage biotech, some are sort of top 20 pharma. We do a set of terrestrial screening, sort of first here on the ground. A part of it is just doing what I call like theoretical analysis, basically just understanding is the primary sort of driver of the problem that this drug is experiencing sort of thermodynamics, which we're a little bit less relevant for, versus sort of kinematics, which we're sort of much more sort of relevant for, given that gravity is a factor in one versus not the other. The second step is we actually go through what we call our hypergravity screening process. So I alluded to at the very beginning of my answer, you can't decrease gravity down here on Earth, but you can increase it. And so we take that drug, and let's say, for example, one of the things you're trying to do is control crystal size and have a more narrow distribution of the size of those crystals. If you see that at 1G versus as you increase gravity to 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G here down here on Earth, and you start to see an increasing distribution of crystalline sizes, well, you can hypothesize that if you go down to zero gravity, you're more likely to get a more narrow, basically, distribution of crystalline sizes. And so we published one of our sort of first papers. It's available on our website on this, using this amino acid L-histidine that we studied in hypergravity that had also been previously studied in microgravity. That process for sort of screening a drug takes about sort of 9 months or so. From there, you at that point have validated that gravity is a dominant sort of factor. You validate that it solves the problem that you have. At that point, it's about another sort of 3 to 4 months of basically transitioning that process to our microgravity, basically sort of drug reactor, preparing that compound for flight. Almost certainly, you'll do an initial flight as a sort of sort of proof point and demonstration, and then analyze those materials down on the ground. If all sort of goes according to plan, at that point, the goal would be to sort of call it 6 to 9 months after that, do a sort of larger sort of run where right now our drug reactors are really optimized around what we call like mass parallelization, right? The goal is test lots of drugs across lots of conditions. At some point, once you get your sort of quote unquote hit that you were looking for, at that point you may sort of fly a drug reactor that's more optimized for a single process, single connection, single drug, but larger amount of production, so you could should go into a clinical trial. And so I think definitely some sort of long road sort of ahead of us to get this sort of fully commercialized into patients' hands on just as sort of any other sort of pharmaceutical development program sort of goes through, but obviously with the added challenges of aerospace schedules and timelines. But I think there's a sort of pretty reasonable sort of shot that in 2028 sort of Varda has compounds in sort of clinical trials, and obviously a lot of proof points ahead of that, and that we'll probably know by like early 2027 that we will be able to sort of hit that sort of time frame.
Great, thanks. The next question will come from Scott, a friend of the channel. Scott, take it over.
Space, thank you for having me up, and Delian, thank you for coming on.
No problem.
My first question is in regards to the time frame for the next couple craft. So, Varda was originally planning to launch W2, I think in November, if memory serves, and now it sounds like W2 and W3 are both planned to fly in Q1 of 2025. Will these be flying together on the same Falcon 9? And similarly, do you guys expect them to be re-entering around the same period?
So what I can say is we plan to launch on every single transporter sort of mission, which are the sort of rideshare missions that SpaceX provides. I think technically we do have some restrictions around. I'm not allowed to comment on SpaceX's sort of launch schedule, but what I can say is that move from sort of November to Q1 was not sort of driven by internal Varda schedule. That was sort of driven by the sort of launch schedule. There are currently two launches planned for Q1. For now, we do not plan to have multiple programs on a single rocket launch. So that would imply that there are two transporter missions in Q1. But I think beyond that, I would say sort of look at the so SpaceX launch schedule, and you can expect that for 2025. Varda will be on every single transporter launch, and historically they've done about sort of 4 of those per year. In 2026, definitely for the first half of the year, we expect to just have a single basically mission per transporter launch. But towards the second half of 2026 is when we'll start to have multiple basically sort of missions, multiple satellites per transporter slot, and then you'll see it sort of ramp up from there until at some point we start to think about sort of dedicated launches. We may start to think about larger satellites. Obviously sort of Starship may come online, but at least for so 2025 and 2026, planning to just sort of stick to the transporter missions, and only in the later half of 2026 will we start to think about multiple slots basically per transporter mission.
Cool. And I guess as a follow-up to that, you mentioned launching and landing 4 times in 2025. As I understand, W2, 3, and 4 are all using Rocket Lab buses and some components from them, leaving us with one outstanding craft in 2025, I guess being the W5. Is this craft also expected to be using Rocket Lab's bus and components? And to kind of put 2 questions into one, do you guys plan to continue your relationship with Rocket Lab using their buses and components, or is this something that we could maybe see developed in-house for future missions?
What I'd say is, publicly we have only confirmed that W2 and W3 will be launched with the Rocket Lab bus. I think sort of beyond that, we're sort of not yet sort of commenting on what our architecture will be, but obviously after the close of the W3 mission, we'll obviously sort of be talking about what sort of future architectures may look like. And I think with us, it's always going to be sort of a sort of case by case basis, and I think we'll always reassess our priors sort of each sort of year in terms of what's available sort of commercially, what makes sense to sort of have in house, what makes sense to sort of buy off the shelf. I think so if you sort of compare the environment that we're in today relative to sort of call sort of SpaceX in the sort of late 2000s. Thankfully, I think there's much more robust sort of supply chain and commercial providers, and so thankfully I don't have to build my own rocket. Obviously, for our first 3 missions, we didn't have to sort of build our own bus, and we expect that over time there will maybe sort of more and more that we go full stack. But I don't think we'll ever need to necessarily go nearly as full stack as SpaceX has, given just how mature the supply chain is today in the broader commercial aerospace ecosystem. So I think only really sort of W2 and W3 have we fully confirmed publicly what that architecture is going to look like.
Okay, cool. And I'll squeeze one last question in. You mentioned that you have a number of SpaceX launches throughout 2025 and onward. Um, are are you guys considering launching with any of these new kids on the block, like Firefly, Stoke, or maybe even Rocket Lab's Neutron, as these new gen vehicles come to market? Or does it make more sense to stick with SpaceX, given the Falcon 9's track record of making it to orbit in one piece?
As a company, we want to really focus on, only taking risk in the areas that we see as our core, sort of expertise, right? If you look at, in some ways the, sort of partnership with Rocket Lab, we did not, sort of think of as our core expertise and what we're really trying to differentiate ourselves on as, sort of satellite buses. Our core differentiation is the combination of our microgravity, basically, sort of drug reactors and the production that we do there, as well as the reentry technologies to, sort of bring those down on a, sort of consistent basis. I'm not particularly, sort of interested in taking, sort of risk in relation to launch, but I'm also, sort of economically, sort of rational. If somebody, sort of provides me an economic case and a sort of, risk case that makes sense for our business, I don't think we're, sort of wedded to, any, sort of one provider. I don't think, sort of we see that on the horizon. Sort of, anytime soon, and but I would obviously always be thrilled to see, across all of our, sort of vendors in our supply chain, for there to, be maturity in that, and for there to be more, sort of optionality. I think that puts us in a more powerful position. But yeah, for now, have not necessarily, sort of seen anything that would convince, sort of me that there's an alternative that presents anywhere near the, sort of same economic or risk case.
Cool, that makes a ton of sense. All right, well, Delian, wishing you and Varda all the best in 2025 and space. Thanks again for bringing me up. I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks, Scott. Great question as usual. Delian, I want to be cautious of your time. Do we still have time for a couple of questions?
Go for it. Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. So there's other companies like Redwire Space that are also doing some sort of microgravity research, but they're using space stations. How do you guys differentiate, taking into account that you guys are working with a reentry capsule? How do you see yourself versus that type of research on board space stations?
I think I always go back to, this Jeff Bezos, sort of quote, which is, he very frequently gets the question about, so what's going to change the next few years. And, he submits the second question that's actually more important is what's not going to change. And what's not going to change is that, our customers are going to want things that are more capable, that are higher cadence, and that are, sort of cheaper. As somebody that I think has a pretty strong, sort of physics engineering background, I have a really hard time seeing how something that so significantly involves sort of humans in relation to production at scale in orbit can ever sort of accomplish what our sort of customers need. And so it's really great to see sort of people that are doing some sort of basic research and things that sort of do require the dexterity of humans. That's great. The vast majority of biopharmaceutical production down here on Earth does not require humans, and I wouldn't expect that to sort of change when you sort of go up into the sort of microgravity environment of low Earth orbit. And so I think we really stay focused on sort of serving our clients and being the most capable, the sort of cheapest, and the sort of highest cadence solution. And I have a really hard time figuring out how a sort of human rated space station architecture really ever gets close to that. And I think our sort of customer traction has reflected that.
Makes a lot of sense. So working with automation, robotization, it's all part of the plan, I guess.
Yeah, these aren't like 6 degrees of sort of freedom, robot arms, sort of moving around. At the end of the day, when you look at what it takes to sort of automate sort of drug production, this is just off the shelf sort of capabilities that are available today. We obviously have to sort of re-engineer the hardware because we have to operate in microgravity. We've got to survive launch. We've got to survive reentry. But at the end of the day, this isn't again robot arms moving around doing highly complex dexterous activities. This is fluids. This is pumps. This is valves. These are sort of reaction chambers. At the end of the day, do you know what a sort of a vacuum sort of rocket engine looks like? It is pumps, it is valves, it is fluid movement. They're also doing massive combustion and crazy sort of thermal problems. And so at the end of the day, I'd like to say what Varda is doing up there isn't quite rocket science. It's sort of basically there, and that we're mixing around sort of fluids and sort of valves and everything. But I don't see any reason why if they can't make quote unquote robotic rocket engines, why can't we make sort of quote unquote robotic sort of drug reactors? And so we've managed to sort of show that success in our first sort of mission. I don't see any reason why that won't sort of continue to be the case in all our future missions.
That makes a lot of sense. So, do you ever see a future where reentry becomes as common as launch?
That is one of the sort of core KPIs that we sort of drive towards. At Varda, at the end of the day, if I had to choose between one massive reentry to serve our customers versus one smaller reentry, but every single day of the week, absolutely, our customers care sort of a lot more about iteration cycle, cadence, and sort of consistency than one-off sort of mass movement of material. And so, definitely sort of KPI that we track internally in that sort of cadence is king. The more often that we fly, the more customers we're able to serve, the more customers we're able to serve, the more contracts we have, the more contracts we have, the more often we're able to fly. And it's this, sort of flywheel that continues to spin up. And so, while, I don't think we should be, sort of flying for the sake of flying, we should be flying to say, sort of serve our customers. I do think our flight cadence is basically, sort of the core metric to track, sort of our success. And so it's really exciting to see, obviously, sort of our first flight in 2024. I think, it's sort of pretty phenomenal for, opening our office doors in January 21 and 3 years and a month later, landing our first vehicle, and going from that to the following year to four, and obviously continuing to sort of up the sort of cadence from there, which is a combination of balancing sort of customer demand, our internal supply chain and production, and obviously sort of launch availability. But feel quite confident that we'll be able to sort of continue to up the cadence and get to the point where by the sort of 2028 time period, we're at a more than once a month cadence, which I think will be sort of really exciting for humanity, to have sort of reentry at that cadence, and by the end of the decade, be on the order of once every 10 days or so.
Awesome. So, I guess you guys fixed the issue with the deep state, to reuse the term mentioned earlier, when it comes to reentry.
For now, we decided to sort of pivot to Australia, which has been sort of much more welcoming than the sort of deep state of the United States. But thankfully, there is this sort of new 47th president who I hear one of his priorities is to demolish the deep state. So feeling pretty good about being able to come back to the United States by the 2026 sort of time frame. But while they're getting their hands dirty and fixing those problems, we're gonna just stick to the simplicity of down under, given how excited they are to sort of host us there.
All right, great. So, maybe one last one, if you don't mind. If you put your VC hat on, what would be the next big space applications? We're a group here of space investors looking at the next big thing. Got our eyes on it, but you probably have another kind of view with your expertise as a partner of at Founders Fund. So, what would you say is the next big thing in the space applications field?
Yeah, I think if you study the sort of general tech or early sort of internet days, you have these sort of generations of companies where in order to sort of even have the internet, you need to have semis. In order to have sort of routing, you need these network sort of switches. And sort of once each of those sort of generations of companies became mature, it enabled the next generation. And so if I call like Gen One in like the 2007 period, it was basically like launch, internet, and basically sort of orbital imaging, Earth-based, Earth imaging, and those were really the only applications that made any sense. And then in some ways, that generation took the next 13 years to mature, and it wasn't until 2020 where basically Falcon 9s finally became consistently reusable that the sort of second generation sort of finally became available. I don't think it was an infinite sort of set of sort of business cases that made sense. Obviously, I think there's accelerations in internet, satellite internet, as well as Earth observation. And then, I think there's really only, sort of two use cases that we really believe in space production. Obviously, Varda, and then what we call the sort of, given that there's enough, sort of cars on the road, there's now sort of the taxis and the gas stations, and so call it in orbit movement and in orbit servicing, which we think Impulse Space and Tom Mueller are going to be able to dominate. And then I think realistically, it's going to play out, sort of similar to the first generation, where it's going to take about 7 years for this to mature before there are, sort of net new applications. I think as a VC, it's super exciting to see all the lunar activity. It's not something that I feel sort of comfortable sort of betting on sort of quite yet. But 7 years from today, when sort of Starship is even sort of more online, companies like sort of Varda and Impulse are even more mature, then it starts to, I think, become in the realm of possibility for me as a VC to really think about the sort of return time frame for funding like a lunar sort of ice mining sort of operation, because at that point Varda may be consuming a lot of water in low Earth orbit, and it's a hell of a lot cheaper to be getting that from the surface of the moon than from the gravity well of Earth. But I think as optimistic as I am about our ability to get back to the moon, I think right now it's mostly public capital that makes sense to be sort of risking, and only sort of once that's a bit further along, would I want to be sort of funding sort of lunar based investments. But yeah, that's at least kind of how we think about it. I think there was this generation two of companies. We were very active in early stage investing in the 2021 and 2020 timeframe at Founders Fund on the aerospace side of things. We've taken a sort of step back and mostly now focus on sort of mid stage sort of winners, and then I think we'll get back to sort of early stage aerospace investing again, probably in the like sort of 2028 timeframe, as we start to see sort of Starship sort of commercially really come online, and some of the lunar landers have some sort of maturity, which means that lunar access now is something that is sort of more reliable.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, Delian, it's been awesome to hear about Varda's journey and your vision for the future. Thanks for joining us today and taking the time to share your insights with us.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a great rest of your guys' day. And if anybody wants to reach out, feel free to slide into the DMs. Cheers, everyone.
Awesome. Cheers. Thanks. So, to our listener, be sure to follow Varda Space updates on their website and here on X. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Bye bye.